Welcome to Compression for Audiobooks. I really hope you enjoy this free training. If you want to know more information about mastering for audiobooks, be sure to check out tomorrow's email for something bigger. So, when we're talking about compression, it's one of those things that I've always used in every audiobook I've ever worked on. We're going to be talking about and taking a look at how and why we use compression in every audiobook that you record. So my goal for this evening is I'm going to show you how you can even out even the worst vocal just in dynamics to create a better listening experience for your author, your rights holder, and in my opinion, honestly, more importantly, your end listener. I mean, those are the people that are buying your audiobooks and they're the ones that are reaching for either the author because they really like them, or honestly, in my experience, I've known that they really like it because of you, right? There's a lot of audiobook listeners that will reach out because of your voice and they are driven to your voice. So in the next 45 minutes, we'll be going over 3 myths of compression that prevent people from creating a great sounding audiobook. And then what the settings mean in a compressor, just because compression can be so scary, honestly. When people first get into anything audio, it can be really scary for them. They get really nervous. They're not really sure what all of the settings do. And then after that, we'll figure out how you can tame the loud parts of a vocal while still maintaining a natural sound, which is super important. One of the number one things you want to do in every type of processing or in mastering is to always sound natural. Big thing for just me personally when I'm working on any audiobook is just they're very conversational, right? So you want to be able to maintain that conversational feeling. So staying natural is key. And then I will give you an in-depth walkthrough of how I use compression. And the example I'm going to show you is pretty dynamic. It's got a lot of loud parts, but it's also got really quiet parts. And this is kind of the method that I've used on almost all 6,000 audiobooks that I've worked on. So I know that seems like a lot, but we will jump right into it and you'll see. And now you'll definitely want to stay till the end because for the people that stay till the end, I'm going to be giving you a link and I'll be dropping it in the chat where then you can download. If I don't drop it in the chat, I'm going to be doing it through the email. So if you're on my email list, I'll be sending out a link for that tomorrow as well for my downloadable go to starter settings that I use every time. And they're definitely starter settings. So I always start with the settings in this guide that I'll be giving out. But because every voice is different, every DAW is different, you're going to want to adjust those to your voice and your situation, right? So, and just a couple of important reminders that you're here obviously because you are really passionate about audiobooks. You either do this for a living or you're trying to do this for a living, and you want them to translate to the world, right? Not just your your rights holder, but to your audiobook listener. So, what I'm gonna show you in this training isn't just a set it and forget it, use these settings and they'll work for every voice. You are gonna have to put in the results, or you're gonna have to put in the work to get the results so you can hear it and see it. So, because of this training, and we're only gonna be going for about an hour or so, I just highly suggest that you shut off your phone or you put it into airplane mode so that way you can get the most out of this training. So, if you don't know me, my name is Ryan May, and I do make a living for the past 11 years now, at least 11 years in audiobooks, editing, mastering, and proofing audiobooks. And I don't necessarily do a whole lot of proofing now, but my beautiful wife there, Aubrey is her name, she is an audiobook proofer. So we've been doing that for quite a while. I've been doing it for 11 years. She's been doing proofing now for roughly 5. 10 of those years for me was at Brilliance Publishing in West Michigan, where I currently reside. 9 of those years being an audio engineer, and actually into my last year, I became the audio production manager, um, where I would utilize outsourcing vendors like Dion Audio, John Marshall Media, and things like that. And because of me having that experience, it's 6,000 plus or thereabouts audiobooks in under my belt. So that's between recording, editing, mastering, and I've directed one. Directing just wasn't my strong suit. I liked it, but so that's where the 6,000 comes from. So it does sound like it's a lot, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not that much. So a little bit more about me. I did start out as a music guy, still actually really big into music. You can see there the picture on the far left. I had no soundproofing. I was just kind of starting out. That led me to then Chicago, where my now wife, when we were just engaged, uh, got my dream job of being able to work in a recording studio. You can see me there in that picture where I got my arms folded behind the studio owner. But then we got married. We ended up starting a family, and that's what led me back to Michigan. And I started at Brilliance Publishing, where I then worked as an engineer and a audio production manager. And then this is where I can totally feel a sense of what maybe you all have been going through. Is now I'm running my own small little audiobook production company where my wife is proofing, I'm editing, mastering, and I do small recordings here and there if needed. But why I say it can somewhat relate to you is if you're not already doing this for a living, I took that big leap. Now I don't narrate, but I took that big leap to quit my day job and go full time working for myself. And if that's you out there as a narrator that is trying to make it happen, it can be very nerve wracking. But I'll say, if and when you're ready, totally take that leap and start working for yourself. It's been a dream come true. And, I just left Brilliance actually this year in May. So I'm only a couple of months in. So far, it's been a great ride. Okay. So, what I learned in that amount of time at Brilliance, I'm gonna show you what I took through that 10 years, but, what I did initially was the hard way, right? It was 10 years of making mistakes and then trying what I thought the internet, at least in 2012, that's when I started at Brilliance. There wasn't a lot of things about audiobooks back in 2012 online. But taking that, interpreting it into my own way, and I just kept on getting it wrong until I started figuring out how to actually make a narrator sound really good. So the hard way is spending years of trying to figure out how to master or process. I know those are kind of interchangeable. But then searching endlessly online through tutorials, and then you've got to figure out how to link those all together, right? Because every narrator is different where they're using all different DAWs. So I personally, even though I'm not a narrator, I use Pro Tools. But there's a lot of narrators, even in the ACX groups or the other narrator groups out there, that use Audacity, they use Adobe Audition, they use Studio One, and if you don't have everything connected together, you end up wasting a lot of time or money just because you're trying to link those all together, right? And then you got to figure out how it all connects to your situation, which could end up leaving you frustrated. So let's get right into what is compression for audiobook mastering. And audiobook compression, or just compression in general, in its basic term is it narrows the difference between the loudest parts and the softest parts of audio to give it a more consistent level. You can see the picture there on the right or the left, I'm sorry, of the uncompressed signal where you've got all those different peaks and valleys. But then over there on the right side, nice and compressed, still even, but not overly compressed, still leaving in dynamics to make yourself sound natural and fluid, right? So when do we use compression? And it's basically when the transients, which is the first part of an audio signal, is sticking out of what I call the mix or the audio, whatever you want to call it, too much. So the yellow line in these two pictures represents a threshold. So with compression, what you're doing is you're taming down those initial transients. You're not shaving them off, you're just reducing them. Then we can get into the controls of the compressor because this is one of those things that can really trip people up. There can be a decent amount of controls on a compressor. What do they all mean? How do they all work together? So the first one, as shown, is the ratio, and this tells the compressor how much to turn the audio signal down by. So you'll see something like a 2 to 1, 4 to 1, 6 to 1, 8 to 1, depending on the plugin that you're using, right? The plugin I'm going to show you once we get into an audiobook session, I actually have a fixed threshold on the plugin of my choice. So it's not anything that I can necessarily adjust, but that's the threshold, right? So when it comes in terms of a ratio, this is just how much the compressor is going to turn the signal down by. So when we look at a ratio, when you got 1 to 1, there is no compression happening at all, right? It's unity gain. 2 to 1 is going to be your light compression, and 3 to 1 thereabouts. 4 to 1 is when you start to get into that moderate compression. 6 to 8 to 1 is heavier compression. Then when you're getting up to basically 10 and above, even up to uh, 20 to 1, you're almost in that limiting territory. Especially if you get into 20 to 1, you're basically getting into a limiter territory, which will then completely shave off all of those peaks and not really leaving you a lot of room for dynamics. The audio will cross the threshold, and then the compressor will turn that peak down to basically what you set that ratio to. So, for example, with a ratio of 2 to 1, it basically indicates that the signal exceeding a threshold of 2 dB will then be turned down by 1. So then if you have an 8 to 1 ratio, you are then turning the signal down by 4. So it's cutting it in half. Does that make sense? Just leave me a comment in the chat if it makes sense or if it doesn't, and then we can continue to move on. And I'll be going through once we jump into the session, you'll actually be seeing how the ratio I'll be using might not hit exactly what I need. Cool. All right, let's keep moving on here. So with the threshold, this is the level that compression begins. As soon as your signal crosses the threshold, it says, "Hey, compressor, we need to start turning this down." So it will do that based on what the ratio is set to. So they kinda interchange, they kinda intermingle and play together. You set your ratio for a good generic basic setting for anything vocal. I usually start with a 4 to 1 just because it's lighter, but it's more moderate. It's not too heavy, it's not gonna overly compress, but starting at a 4 to 1 will give you more of an even, more smooth flow of that transition, and then you get into your threshold, and when I'm using a normal compressor, kinda like what's shown on the screen here, I will look for gain reduction of anywhere around 3 dB to 8 dB, just depending on how dynamic they actually the vocal actually is. So then we've got knee. Some compressors do not have this. The compressor I'm actually gonna be showing you today does not have a knee, but I wanted to include this just because with the DAW that you may be using, you might have a knee. So a knee is how the compressor transitions between the compressed and the non-compressed audio. If you use a harder knee, which you'll see visually on a compressor like what's here on the screen, it'll basically give it a cutoff point, and that's at full ratio. It's very, very aggressive. If you have a knee that's a little bit more rounded, like the one here on screen, it's more gradual. And it's basically, hey, as we're coming in and out of compression, let's just ease off of the compression a little bit. So that way it sounds more smooth. It's a smoother transition, not hitting as hard as so it's not so aggressive. Attack, kind of self-explanatory, but this is how fast the compressor actually starts to work, compressing the audio. So the way I like to think about it is like a gas pedal. You're in a car, right? When you press down when the light turns green and you slam down on that pedal, you go instantly, right? There might be a little bit of kickback, might be a little delay, but the general census is you take off right away. 0 to 60, right, in 2 seconds. If you are a slower attack, though, it's you pressing down on that gas pedal a little bit more gently, okay? So you're still gonna go, you're just not gonna go right away at at 0 to 60. And release is just the opposite of that. It's how quickly the compressor lets go of compressing the signal. So as you take your foot off of the gas pedal, you're still moving, but you will start to just coast, right? Gain, if you have this, is just how much you want to increase or decrease the overall volume of the compressed signal. So you can utilize the gain knob to make it match what your original audio was before it was compressed. Now, there can be a lot of talk about how what order plugins can go into, but we can get to that in a different presentation here. So one thing I do want to like really stress is just how not to ruin your vocal, and you probably all know this, but if you don't, the biggest thing is just to not over compress. Over compression will lead to distortion, clipping, digital artifacts, and a really harsh sounding listening experience, similar to blown speakers in a car. Crank up that volume enough, and the signal is just crunchy, right? It doesn't sound pleasing at all. So, with that, before we jump into the session, is there any questions? Okay. Well, I don't see any comments coming in right now. So, we're going to jump over to the session, and I'm just going to, just for all of you out there, I'm just going to play the audio. Just let me know if you can hear it. And we did a couple of tests before the broadcast here. But I want to just make sure that all of you can hear everything. So I'm going to hit the play, and just because there is a little bit of delay, just want to make sure that all of you guys can hear this.
And insect colonization. But that's just a preliminary finding, so don't quote me.
Okay, can we hear that coming through? Cool. Right on. Jetsa says yes. MJ says yes. Ryan says sounds great. Bob, cool. All right. So as you can see here, this recording is extremely dynamic. This is from an audiobook by Bob Lezen, narrated by, I think it's called, oh, yep, All the Dead Girls, and it's narrated by Cynthia Farrell. If anyone's ever heard of Cynthia, she's a great friend. But as you can see, this is her raw recording, and she can get pretty dynamic. She really gets intense with her characters, and causes for a lot going on with the different peaks and valleys. So I'm going to zoom in here real quick, so you can just see here. I'm going to pull up the Pro Tools meter. If you don't have this feature in your DAW, that's okay. The main reason why I'm pulling this up is because it allows me to see a little bit more on a visual aspect of where we're hitting these peaks. So I'm going to play the audio, and I'm just going to pay attention to this meter and just see where we're generally getting those high peaks. And then with a low amount here, I'm going to zoom in a little bit more, how much we're getting there.
I'd put the time of death at around a week and a half ago, given the state of decomposition and So don't quote me. Can you confirm whether or not she
Okay. So I should say too that this is a Pro Tools meter. In Pro Tools, this is just going by a Pro Tools Classic. I have an option to go to a sample peak, venue, and a venue RMS, which venue is just a type of console that Avid, the creators of Pro Tools, made. So I could always just check by RMS as well. I will say though that I don't necessarily pay attention to the number in the amount of time in the 10, 11 years that I've been doing audiobooks. I don't really pay attention to the exact numbers of where it's hitting. The thing that I care most about in a raw recording is that the the normal level, okay? So when I say normal, I'm just kind of lack for better words there, but anything that's not super loud right here, we know that this is gonna jump up like crazy. So this hits at, like, just under -3,
I I
so basically at -3. But then this audio
death at around a week and a half ago, given the
is -12. Now this is -3, -12 in the Pro Tools system. This is an actual, like, peak, okay? So this is Pro Tools peak. Basically, what I look for is 3/4 of the way up. That's all I care about. So the numbers don't really matter. So when I'm thinking about 3/4 of the way up, for me, at least in this Pro Tools meter, is around -8. That's all I care about. And then when I apply my compressor, I wanna make sure that my compressor also, after the signal is being compressed, it still stays at a -8 range. So one thing I will preface is that I always start with compression. The main reason is because I want to give the audiobook that I'm working on the best chance for my end limiter. So if I can start with compression and make sure that this entire audiobook is completely even, then I can worry about things like the background noise where I'm going to apply an expander. Then I can move on and do EQ and then do de-essing or limiting. So one of the reasons why I choose that is just because it's going to give you a more even sound. I don't use any other outside tool or any external tool unless I need it. So I know that there are a lot of narrators that say, "Well, I always run declick," and that's fine. That's great. If you're the type of narrator that has more of a clicky mouth, then totally use it. So I say that with a caveat because if I'm dealing with a narrator that is really clicky or has a lot of background noise or there's something else going on, I will 100% make sure that I clean that up and then run my normal tools. But because this audiobook is already really clean sounding,
her name was Gina. What can you tell us based on your first
it's just really dynamic, right? But it's clean. So that tells me I don't need to run anything else except for compression, expansion, EQ, a limiter to get the volume there, and de-essing to clean up the sibilants. But since we're talking about compression, let's dive into that. So this is my compressor of choice. I use the T-Rax Black 76. This is a 1176 style compressor. It's kind of from the old school days of reel-to-reel tape, and a lot of music producers these days still use something similar to this. The reason why I use a compressor like this is because it makes me use my ears. There's really no visuals on it except for the VU meter here, which I won't lie. I mean, any person that's working on audio say that if they say they don't use their eyes, they're lying because they definitely do. And I do because I'm also looking for that gain reduction. That really helps me kind of train my ears to if I'm over compressing and I'm going all the way down to -7 or -10, does it sound overcompressed? Does it sound squashed? Does it sound crunchy? Does it sound like there's too much grit, too much aggression, too much harshness? Well, if I can use my eyes a little bit, I can tell that it's getting there. So without doing anything yet with this compressor, let's just see what type of reaction we're getting on the VU meter and how that's translating to this Pro Tools meter here.
Greet them. Her name was Gina. What can you tell us based on your first impressions? Bauer asked after the introductions were done. Gina glanced back toward the body.
So you can see that there is some compression happening even without me touching anything. This is just factory default on these settings. But when the high peak came up, it did compress a little bit. And when it was normal speaking without any dynamic range, the compressor wasn't doing anything. So I'm going to go with that generic setting of starting with a 4-to-1, which is actually the default of what this is set to. Because this because this compressor already has a fixed threshold, the only thing I have to worry about is either my ratios, my input, my output knob, and my attack and my release. So when we get into it, I'm going to first give you a couple of options that you can use. To give it away instantly, I will say that I always use a moderately fast attack and a moderately fast release. The main reason, now I'm going to jump on screen here for just a hot minute because I'm visual, uh, is that when I use a fast attack, the main reason is because what a compressor does, again, is it clamps down on those loud transients. And then it's going to leave those quieter transients or the quieter volume, the signal coming through, not really touched. When using a faster attack, and I'm going to be visual here, I want the compressor to clamp down on those loud parts, but then using a fast release to let go. So that way, when you do have an area of a louder part and then a quieter part right after that, I want that compressor to let go really quick. So that way, that signal is not compressed, allowing for no change of that quieter part. But I want it to get compressed really quick so that way it's not jarring, right? It's not it doesn't have like a pumping sound. When you use a slower attack, it gives this sense of the compressor not being able to keep up right away with a extremely slow attack, I should say. Where it can't keep up, so before the next transient comes in, the compressor hasn't let go yet, leaving this back and forth motion of sound wavering and feeling like it's pumping in and out or the audio is ducking up and down. So let's go back to this session. But I'm going to give you an example of a slower attack, right? And for right now, I'm going to just leave the release in the middle just so that way we're not doing too quick or too slow. It's just kind of middle of the road. So that way there's not a lot happening to it on the release side of the signal. But with a slower attack, now on this plugin, I have to go all the way to the left. The right side is faster. So let's just give this a listen. I'm going to zoom in again just so we can actually like see these transients. And we'll watch and listen to how this compressor is reacting with a slower attack once it gets through here and then it gets into this next sentence.
Not in her current state, the medical examiner replied. If the body was fresh, lividity might tell us. We could look at how the blood settled in the body and see if there was any contact blanching.
See, there's not really a lot happening. It's still compressing because I've engaged it, right? But it's not keeping up. So by having a slower attack, it is going to give you more impact and punchiness because it's going to let those initial transients come through, but just not turning down the initial transient right away. But because of more audio constantly coming into it, because in narration, you're telling a story, right? So there's going to be more coming through that it's going to give you that uneven performance. So just to make sure, uh, you're not going too much. Let's see what we get when we do a faster attack. And I'm just gonna for this example, I'm gonna turn it all the way up.
Not in her current state, the medical examiner replied. If the body was fresh, lividity might tell us.
So you can see here on in this sentence especially, even when she said Lavidia might tell us, there was still a little bit of compression. In my opinion, a little too fast. So I like to back that off. But let me put the attack into a neutral position, and then we can hear the difference on the release side of things. So if we go with a slow release, and this for this again, same example, I'm gonna do the same thing where it's just all the way slow, right? Which isn't really realistic, but this will give you smoother compression, but it can suck the life out of the sound because the compressor hasn't let go or won't let go of the initial compressed audio before your words have even stopped, right? So, what I mean by that is while this audio is coming in, and then you get another loud part like right here, this has not let go. The compressor has not let go of this part before this part's coming in. Does that make sense? I'll show you an example here in just a second. Just want to make sure that we're kind of following there because I'm slightly moving a little quick. I just want to make sure that I'm not going too much. We are doing a Q&A at the end of this, so if anyone has any questions, you don't feel like asking it now, totally cool. We'll just wait till the end. Cool. I don't see anything coming through yet, so we'll keep moving. All right, so let me give you the example of that slower release. And you'll just kind of hear how it still might sound good, but it's just going to be a little bit more uneven, and those transients won't have let go from the compressor yet.
If the body was fresh, lividity might tell us. We could look at how the blood settled in the body.
So right here, I don't know if you guys heard the same thing. If you're wearing headphones, I'm wearing headphones. I feel I can hear there's some pumping going on right in this area. Because there's a little bit of quiet sections just in this area, and especially right here throughout this area, when these transients come in, or these peaks come in, the compressor hasn't fully let go of them yet. But then it's like, well, hey, then what do I do here? Well, I got to let go of these first. And that's where you get a little bit of that ducking audio.
If the body was fresh, lividity might tell us. We could look at how the blood settled in the body.
So when you listen to this part,
We could look at how the blood's
when we can look at to me is really quiet. Not really quiet, but in the sense like you can tell it dips down. So now let's do the opposite of that. Go to a faster release. So I just crank this all the way up. What a faster release is going to do is it's going to give off a little bit more aggression to turn down those first initial transients.
not in her current state, the medical examiner replied. If the body was fresh, lividity might tell us. We could look at how the blood settled in the body and see if there was any contact blanching.
Cool. So it was definitely letting go really, really quickly, but because I had the attack in a neutral spot, it was too slow for those initial loud transients to come in, right? So now that we've kind of talked about attack and release, I'm going to put these back to a neutral position because I know you might be wondering about the input and the output, at least on this compressor. The way I treat this compressor in any session I'm working on, especially with something that's this dynamic, if I just zoom out again, what I'm looking for is, well, number one, With these transients being so loud and so dynamic compared to the quieter parts, on the Pro Tools meter, I was also seeing that we were almost peaking out, right? It was almost to the clipping point. If it wasn't reaching -3, it was just under unity gain at 0. And I want to tame that. What I want to do is make sure that I always have control to keep that 3/4 of the way up. Because I know I have too loud of a signal here, with the ratio, there is a little bit of experimentation, right? My rule of excuse me, my rule of thumb is that if I am with dealing with something that's really dynamic like this, where I've got a decent amount of quiet stuff, but I've got all these different loud parts, and then it goes back to quiet stuff and back to loud stuff. I need to control my number one job is to control those loud parts because I could turn these up all day long, right? And we could do that with the output knob. But if I can't turn down these loud transients, I need to balance these out somehow. Because of that, I'm going to stick with a 4-to-1 ratio. I'm going to see with my input knob. I'm not going to adjust my output knob right now, but I'm going to see on my input knob just to see if I'm getting my 3 to 5 of dB in gain reduction and then go from there.
I'd put the time of death at around a week and a half ago, given the state of decomposition and insect colonization. But that's just a preliminary finding, so don't quote me.
Yeah, we're getting way too much even on this. So, because there's still too much even on this Pro Tools meter, that just tells me I need to reduce in my ratio more of that signal. So if I'm using an 8-to-1, again, I want to then turn down those peaks that are going over that threshold by at least 4, right? I want to reduce them by 4 because 8-to-1 is going to cut it down in half. So let's go with an 8-to-1 and and I'll play the audio again. And we'll just see what we get in terms of our input to output ratio there.
I'd put the time of death at around a week and a half ago, given the state of decomposition and insect colonization. But that's just a preliminary finding.
Cool. So now that I've got that, I can see that it's reducing it, at least volume wise that I'm listening to, and visually based on the VU meter on the plugin and the Pro Tools meter. It's not getting up to that unity gain or -3 anymore. It's getting a little bit more reduced. So how can I reduce that a little bit more? Well, because I still am noticing that the compressor is not reacting quick enough to turn down the initial transients, but then also let go when the quieter parts are coming on, I need to adjust my tack and release. So I'm going to do that. And my old gold go to is moderately fast. I'm not going to go all the way up, but moderately fast and moderately fast release because again, I want to turn down those initial transients very quickly, but then let go of them very quickly. So that way the plugin or the compressor is not reacting to these quieter parts like I have highlighted these ones here.
I'd put the time of death at around a week and a half ago, given the state of decomposition and insect colonization. But that's just a preliminary finding, so don't quote me. Can you confirm whether or not she was killed here or brought to this site?
So I can see that no compression is happening on those quieter parts, which is actually what I'm looking for because right now, once again, as I mentioned, I can always turn this part up, but I care more about turning these down. That way I can make them nice and even. And then once these are turned down, and then I go and fully turn this up, I can turn all of it up together. But the way I also approach this is I want to stick within that 3/4 of the way up. So here's how I adjust for that. What I actually do is turn down my output. So that way I'm relatively within the same area of compression before, or the same relative area of sound before compression actually happened, right? Because I turned it down though, now I might need to utilize a little bit more input to then get it back up to the 3/4 of the way up, or what I call, at least in this Pro Tools meter, -8. So anywhere from -8 to -6 or thereabouts, that's what I'm looking for. But because I was already really close to the top of this meter and the volume was already getting loud, that tells me first I need to turn down my output. If I put it back to where it was, it's just gonna be really, really loud.
Not in her current state, the medical examiner replied. If the body was fresh, lividity might tell us.
And you can see there, we're just under -3. Well, I wanna get to that -8, right? So let's turn it down.
Not in her current state, the medical examiner replied. If the body was fresh, lividity might tell us.
Okay. Now compression is really starting to happen. It got quieter, right? So there's one issue with that. Everything sounds really good to me with these louder parts. I'm gonna just pump this down a little bit more. With these louder parts, okay? But as soon as a part like these were coming up, the quieter parts, then that's just too quiet. So now what I'm gonna do, because I turned the volume down here, I'm gonna turn my input knob up just a little bit. Probably go, was that like around 11 o'clock or so? And see if I'm getting to that -8 range while my output has been turned down enough, while I'm using the ratio of -8 to shave off those peaks, using a faster attack to clamp down on those peaks, those initial peaks right away, but then use a faster-ish release to then let go again to let these quieter parts come through. And I'll actually show you a processed version of this so you can see how everything will end up getting really evened out.
Not in her current state, the medical examiner replied. If the body was fresh, lividity might tell us. We could look at how the blood settled in the body and see if there was any contact blanching.
Notice how on the compressor, it's only hitting like roughly around -3, maybe -4 or 5 if it's really loud. On the Pro Tools meter, I'm sticking within that -8. Now, on these quieter parts, is it a little below that? It is. But because it's sticking within that -8 range and the compressor is only doing around that -3 to -5 compression, it's sounding a lot more balanced. And these would be settings that I would actually stick with for this initial recording, and I'll show you after that how it gets applied.
Not in her current state, the medical examiner
So there's
replied.
the -8 we're looking
If the
for.
body was fresh, lividity might tell us.
There's the -3 on
We
the
could look at
compressor,
how the blood settled in the body and see if there was any contact
and then
blanching,
not really
which
compression
I would
happening on
expect
the
if she
quieter
was
parts.
moved and laying on a hard surface like the trunk of a car or a truck bed for any period of time shortly after death.
No compression happening there.
Can you tell us how she died then? Patterson stepped aside for a forensic photographer.
So right there, we're still kind of low, but because, as I mentioned just a little bit ago, compression is pretty much my first plugin I use every time, unless I need to use a D-click again, like I mentioned. So I'm not worried about the overall volume right now. This is step one. So with these same settings, let's move this plugin out of the way real quick. And so Pro Tools has an option where you can actually print the setting right to the track. So this plugin right here, because it's in my inserts right in this area, is uh, is happening in real time. Okay, but Pro Tools has this feature where you can actually then print the actual effect down. So I'm just going to move this out of the way, and we'll get rid of this. I'm going to zoom out just so you can see the whole thing. We'll use the same file that we were using, and with the same exact settings that we already had, let's see what this plugin did. Takes just a minute. Okay. So obviously the volume got turned up more, but those quieter parts did get turned up. The louder parts are now more within that area where it's meeting the quieter parts. It's a lot more even. Now, it's not perfectly even, but it's a lot more even. So if I undo that real quick, you can see how dynamic it originally was and how quiet these sections were. If I redo it real quick, you can just see it's starting to level out. Now we could take this a step further. And if I just now with this same plugin where I can actually render it to the audio, if I undo that, give it a little bit more input, but because of that, I got to turn it down just a tad. We can run this one. And when this one goes up, this is where the experimentation comes in. Because if you really want to even out your entire dialogue, you're going to have to be a little bit more aggressive to how it really reacts to it. And there we go. So we're a little bit more even there now. And this would be something. So if we're listening to this, then what I got to do here is actually turn off this plugin, just put it in bypass. So this plugin is just printed. It's not going to play the audio unless I hit this speaker down here. So let's play this and just see how it sounds with it being fully processed.
Short, curly black hair that sprang up as soon as she drew back the hood of her coverall after stepping away from the immediate vicinity of the body to greet them. Her name was Gina. "What can you tell us based on your first impressions?" Bauer asked.
So for me, the way I'm hearing it is it actually it's starting to get into that over compressed range. Right? So if we undo that, that tells me I'll probably need to back off the input, and because of the dynamics, I need to go with a higher ratio. I'm not going to touch the attack and the release because I want them to be moderately fast on both. But with changing the ratio, it's going to say, well, these peaks are just too loud. We need to turn down more. So if we run this with backing this off again, I'm going to zoom out just so we can actually see the whole file once more. We just run this. This is where that experimentation comes in, right? So even myself, who's been doing this for 11 years, and I've been an audio engineer now for around 20, you still always got to kind of play with it just because you don't want anything to get overly compressed. That's still not that much compression, right? It did enough. It still brought the loud things up, but this might be something I would still work with.
With a mass of short, curly black hair that sprang up as.
We'll go to a loud part.
But that's just a preliminary finding, so don't quote me.
Because I still want to have the narrator be pretty natural, right? I don't want to overly compress. That's just going to sound too gritty. You'll hear that over compression, almost like that speaker's getting blown out. And you're human. I want to keep those dynamics in there. And then with that limiter at towards the end of processing, that's where I will turn up that overall volume. So does anyone have any questions right now? See, Jeff, can compression, let me do this for you. Jeff says, can compression be done during recording or is it better to wait till after the recording? Yeah, you're going to want to wait until after the recording. The best thing that you can do is you want to stick with raw audio. You always want to stick with your raw audio for the first half of your recording or just during the recording. And then always do your mastering or your processing after that. And I bet you we could even do one better on this. So if we play this plugin and I undo this a little bit more, I'm going to stick with the 12-to-1 ratio. I'm going to increase my input. I'm going to increase my output just a little bit so we can drive up that signal. Hopefully this won't sound over compressed, but I can always preview it as well.
Gina glanced back toward the body. I'd put the time of death at around a week and a half ago, given the state of decomposition and insect colonization. But that's just a preliminary finding, so don't quote me. Can you confirm whether or not she was killed here?
Cool. Let's give that a listen. That sounded a little bit more even, but it was definitely getting more compressed. So as we're going through, I just hope you can notice that with a higher ratio, that's where you'll be able to say, hey, compressor, we need to start turning these loud peaks down quite a bit. There we go. So still not perfect, right? And that's okay. We look at the Pro Tools meter. Where are we going there?
Insect colonization. But that's just a preliminary finding, so don't quote me.
So a little too much on the output, but just because I turned it up, right? So in a perfect world, I would be turning that back down, but I'm not going to keep going back and forth and just wasting your time on it. But um, it is one of those things that when you're dealing with your ratio, if you have the type of plugin, which you could pull up another plugin that has the threshold on there as well, that's going to tell your compressor, hey, once it crosses this point of the threshold, let's turn it down even more. So that threshold and that ratio will play together.